Life has a funny way of seeming perfect right before it falls apart. That's exactly what happened to Rose, who never saw the storm coming that would turn her world upside down. Back in 2019, Rose's life looked like something out of a dream. Every morning, she'd wake up in her beautiful two-story house in a quiet neighborhood where the neighbors always waved hello and the gardens bloomed with colorful flowers. The house wasn't too big or too small, it was just right, with a cozy kitchen where she loved trying new recipes and a small reading nook by the window where she'd spend rainy afternoons with a cup of tea. At 28, she had already made a name for herself at the children's hospital where she worked as a nurse. Her coworkers often said she had a special touch. She could calm even the most frightened kids with her gentle smile and silly jokes. The children's parents would specifically ask for Nurse Rose because she knew how to make their little ones feel safe and cared for during scary hospital stays. Her husband Michael seemed like the perfect match. They met 5 years ago at a friend's birthday party where he accidentally spilled his drink on her new dress but managed to turn the awkward moment into a cute story they loved telling at dinner parties. He worked as a financial advisor, always dressed sharp in his tailored suits, and never forgot to bring home her favorite chocolate whenever he traveled for work. Their friends called them the Golden Couple. At neighborhood barbecues, Michael would proudly tell everyone how Rose's kindness made him a better person. Rose would blush and change the subject, but deep down, she loved how he bragged about her. They hosted game nights every other Friday, planned romantic weekend getaways, and were even talking about starting a family soon. But life isn't always what it seems on the surface. Like a beautiful pond that looks peaceful above but has currents running deep below, their relationship had hidden struggles that Rose was trying her best to ignore. The late-night calls Michael would take in his home office, speaking in whispers. The mysterious work meetings that kept getting longer and more frequent. The way he changed the subject whenever she brought up their plans to start a family. Still, Rose kept believing in their love story. She'd make his favorite meals, send him sweet text messages during the day, and plan special date nights to keep their spark alive. When her best friend pointed out that Michael seemed distant lately, Rose defended him, saying he was just stressed about a big project at work. She was good at finding excuses for the growing silence between them, for the cold space in their bed, for the way his eyes wouldn't quite meet hers anymore. Looking back, the signs were all there, scattered like breadcrumbs leading to a truth she wasn't ready to see. The unexplained charges on their credit card that he quickly explained away. The new cologne she didn't recognize. The way he stopped sharing stories about his day at work. But love can make us blind to things we're not ready to face, and Rose was deeply in love with the life they built together. She kept herself busy at work, throwing herself into caring for her young patients. There was something healing about helping others, about being the person who could make a scared child smile or a worried parent feel hopeful. Her colleagues noticed she was staying later at the hospital, picking up extra shifts, but they assumed she was just being her usual dedicated self. As their 6th wedding anniversary approached, Rose started planning something special. She wanted to recreate their first date, dinner at the same Italian restaurant where they'd shared awkward jokes and nervous laughter, followed by a walk in the park where they'd had their first kiss. She even bought a new dress, dark blue like the one he'd spilled his drink on all those years ago. The morning of their anniversary, Rose looked at herself in the mirror, touching up her makeup and adjusting her necklace, the pearl pendant Michael had given her on their first anniversary. She smiled at her reflection, excited about the evening ahead, completely unaware that by sunset, her whole world would shatter into pieces she never imagined having to pick up. Sometimes the universe has to break us apart to put us back together in a better way. But standing there in front of the mirror, Rose couldn't have known that the end of her perfect life would actually be the beginning of something real, something true, something even more beautiful than what she thought she had. She couldn't have known that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what you're really meant to have. That evening, Rose left work early for the first time in months. Her coworkers wished her a happy anniversary, and one of the young patients even drew her a card with hearts all over it. The late afternoon sun painted the sky in shades of pink and orange as she drove home, her heart light with anticipation. She'd made reservations at their special restaurant for 7:30, giving them plenty of time to get ready. The first sign that something was wrong hit her when she pulled into their driveway. Michael's car wasn't there, which was strange because he promised to be home early. Maybe he was planning a surprise, she thought, trying to keep her spirits up. But when she opened the front door, the house felt different, emptier somehow, as if the air itself had changed. "Michael?" she called out, her voice echoing in the unusual silence. No answer. She walked through the rooms, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors. The house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to reveal a secret it had been keeping. Then she saw it, a white envelope on the kitchen counter, placed carefully next to the coffee maker where she would be sure to find it. Her name was written on it in Michael's familiar handwriting, but something about those 4 letters looked cold and final. Her hands trembled as she opened it. "Dear Rose," the letter began, and with each word that followed, her world began to crumble. Michael wrote that he had fallen in love with someone else, his company's new marketing director. He said they'd been seeing each other for 8 months. 8 months of lies, of secret meetings, of building a whole different life while pretending everything was fine at home. "I've already moved most of my things out," he wrote. "I'm sorry to do this today of all days, but there's never a good time for goodbye. I've transferred my half of the house payment for this month, but after that, you'll need to figure something out. I wish things could have been different." Rose read the letter 3 times, each word cutting deeper than the last. The restaurant reservation reminder buzzed on her phone, a cruel reminder of the evening she'd planned. She sank to the kitchen floor, still wearing her new dress, the pearl necklace suddenly feeling like it was choking her. As reality began to sink in, she started noticing things she'd missed when she first came home. The closet half empty, his shoes no longer by the door, his favorite coffee mug gone from its usual spot. How had he managed to move so much without her noticing? Had she been so blind, so caught up in preserving their perfect image, that she'd missed him literally moving out of their life? With shaking hands, she opened their online banking app. The truth got worse. Their joint savings account, the one they'd been building for years, dreaming of a family home with a big backyard, was empty. Their shared credit cards were maxed out with charges she'd never seen before, luxury hotels, expensive restaurants, jewelry stores. The life she thought they had was a lie, and now she was left with not just a broken heart, but a mountain of debt she knew nothing about. The phone started ringing, friends calling to wish them a happy anniversary. Rose let it go to voicemail. How could she tell them that their perfect couple had just become another statistic? That the man who had promised to love her forever had packed up his life while she was at work, leaving nothing but a letter and a pile of bills? As night fell, Rose sat in her darkened living room, surrounded by photos of their life together. Each smiling image now felt like a mockery. That vacation in Hawaii last year, had he been thinking of leaving even then? Their last Christmas together, was he already in love with someone else when he gave her that bracelet she now couldn't bear to look at? The worst part wasn't just that he'd left, it was realizing that while she'd been planning their future, he'd been systematically dismantling their present. Every late night at work, every business trip, every secret phone call, they all made terrible sense now. She'd been living in a beautiful dream while he'd been crafting his escape. Around midnight, her best friend showed up unannounced, probably worried when Rose didn't answer any calls. She found Rose still sitting in the dark, clutching that devastating letter. Without a word, her friend sat down beside her and held her while she cried, really cried for the first time since finding the letter. They stayed like that until the sun began to rise, casting long shadows across the floor of a house that no longer felt like home. That night marked the end of Rose's perfect life, but it was also the beginning of something she couldn't see yet. Sometimes we need to lose everything we thought we wanted to make room for what we truly deserve. But in that moment, as the first light of dawn crept through the windows, all Rose knew was that the life she built with such care and love had turned out to be nothing but a beautiful lie. The weeks following Michael's departure felt like walking through thick fog. Rose would wake up each morning, momentarily forgetting, then the reality would hit her all over again. The house that once felt like a dream now seemed to mock her with its emptiness. Every corner held memories she couldn't escape. The first real blow came when she met with her bank. The financial advisor, a kind-faced woman with gentle eyes, laid out the harsh truth. Michael hadn't just maxed out their joint credit cards. He'd taken out several loans in both their names. As his wife, Rose was legally responsible for half of the debt. The numbers made her head spin. $127,000 in total, more money than she'd ever imagined owing. "But I didn't know about any of this," she whispered, staring at the paperwork spread across the desk. "How could he do this without me knowing?" The advisor explained that since they were married, Michael had access to all their financial information. He'd used their joint tax returns and marriage certificate to apply for the loans. Everything was legal, even if it wasn't right. That night, Rose sat at her kitchen table with a calculator and a pile of bills, trying to make sense of her new reality. Her nursing salary was good, but not good enough to cover the mortgage, utilities, and massive debt payments. The house she'd loved so much, with its reading nook and flower garden, would have to go. Her coworkers noticed the change in her. The smile that once came so easily now took effort. Dark circles appeared under her eyes from sleepless nights spent worrying about money. But she threw herself into her work with renewed intensity. Taking care of sick children gave her a purpose, a reason to keep going when everything else felt meaningless. One particularly tough day, she found herself in the hospital chapel during her lunch break. She wasn't particularly religious, but something about the quiet space drew her in. Sitting in the last row, she finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of her anger, not just at Michael, but at herself for being so blind. "I trusted you," she whispered into the empty room, tears rolling down her cheeks. "I trusted you with everything." The real estate agent who came to evaluate the house tried to be gentle with her assessment. "The market is good right now," she explained. "If we list it this week, we might be able to sell before you fall behind on payments." Rose nodded, pretending she couldn't see the pity in the woman's eyes. Packing up the house was like unwrapping her wounds. Each photo album, each shared possession, each little memento had to be sorted: keep, sell, donate, trash. Her best friend came over with boxes and wine, helping her through the hardest parts. They made a game of it, throwing his left-behind clothes into donation bags with exaggerated gestures, but sometimes Rose would find something, his old sweatshirt, a birthday card he'd given her, and the pain would feel fresh all over again. The worst moments came late at night, when the house was too quiet and her thoughts too loud. She'd lie awake, replaying every moment of their marriage, looking for signs she must have missed. Had he ever really loved her? Was their whole relationship just a convenient arrangement for him? The questions circled in her mind like hungry wolves, keeping sleep at bay. Some days, she felt like she was drowning in paperwork, mortgage documents, loan statements, divorce papers. Her kitchen table disappeared under piles of forms that needed signing, each one taking another piece of her old life away. The lawyers spoke in gentle tones, but their words were heavy. Bankruptcy might be her best option. The for sale sign went up on a Tuesday. Rose came home from work to find it planted in her front yard, bright and white against the green grass she tended so carefully. She sat in her car for a long time, staring at it, remembering how proud she'd been when they first bought the house. Now it felt like a billboard advertising her failure. Her young patients became her unexpected source of strength. They faced their own battles with such courage, fighting illnesses, enduring treatments, yet still finding reasons to smile. One little girl, fighting leukemia, made Rose a bracelet out of bright plastic beads. "It's magic," the child whispered. "It helps brave people stay brave." Rose wore it every day after that. The house sold faster than expected. A young couple, newly married, full of dreams just like she had been. Watching them tour the house, holding hands and planning where their furniture would go, Rose felt a strange mix of sadness and hope. Maybe the house would be luckier for them. Moving day arrived on a crisp autumn morning. The moving truck looked too small to hold 5 years of memories, but somehow everything fit. Rose stood in the empty living room, her footsteps echoing against bare walls. This was rock bottom, she thought, leaving her dream house to move into a tiny apartment, starting over at 30 with nothing but debt and broken trust to show for her marriage. But sometimes rock bottom is just a foundation for building something new. Standing there in the empty house, Rose didn't know that this ending was actually a beginning. She couldn't see yet that losing everything would force her to find strength she never knew she had. All she knew was that she had to keep going, one day at a time, even if she couldn't see where the path was leading. Life in the tiny apartment took some getting used to. Rose's new home was a third-floor walk-up with creaky floors and a view of the parking lot, but it was all she could afford while trying to pay off Michael's debt. Her furniture looked out of place there, like props from another life squeezed into a much smaller stage. The first month was the hardest. She'd wake up confused, reaching for walls that weren't there, expecting to hear the coffee maker Michael always set the night before. Instead, she heard the rumble of early morning traffic and the footsteps of her upstairs neighbor heading to work. But slowly, day by day, she started creating new routines. She picked up extra shifts at the hospital, throwing herself into the work she loved. Her colleagues worried she was pushing herself too hard, but caring for others helped her forget her own pain. Besides, every extra hour meant a little more money toward paying off the debt that felt like a weight around her neck. It was during one of these late-night shifts that everything changed. The emergency room was unusually quiet when they brought in a little boy having an asthma attack. His father had rushed him in, still wearing what looked like painting clothes, spattered with different colors. The boy's lips were turning blue, and his small chest heaved with the effort to breathe. Rose sprang into action, a training taking over. As she administered the breathing treatment, she talked softly to the frightened child, telling him silly jokes about why fish don't wear shoes. Gradually, his breathing eased and color returned to his face. His father, who had been watching with terrified eyes, finally allowed himself to breathe too. "You're amazing with him," the father said later when the crisis had passed. His name was Peter, and his son was Andy. "Most nurses just do their job, but you made him feel safe." There was something in his voice, gratitude mixed with something else, that made Rose look up from her charts. Their eyes met for a moment, and Rose felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. Peter wasn't traditionally handsome, but his face was kind, with laugh lines around his eyes and paint spots on his chin that he hadn't noticed. He looked tired, like someone who carried heavy responsibilities, but his smile was genuine. Andy had to stay overnight for observation, and Rose found herself checking on them more often than strictly necessary. She learned that Peter owned a small house painting business, that Andy was in second grade and loved dinosaurs, and that they'd lost Andy's mom to cancer 2 years ago. Peter was raising his son alone, juggling work and parenthood with the help of his sister, who watched Andy after school. "It's not easy doing it all by yourself," Peter said during one of their late-night conversations, while Andy slept peacefully in the hospital bed. "But you just keep going, right? What else can you do?" Rose thought about her own situation, about starting over from scratch at 30. "Yeah," she replied softly, "you just keep going." When it was time for Andy to go home, Rose felt an unexpected sadness. She'd grown attached to the boy's dinosaur facts and his father's quiet strength. But hospitals had rules about professional boundaries, and Rose had learned the hard way not to trust her heart too easily. Life went back to its new normal. Rose worked her shifts, came home to her small apartment, and slowly began to heal. She joined a support group for divorced women, where she found friendship with others who understood her pain. One woman, whose husband had left her for his secretary 10 years ago, now owned a successful business. "Rock bottom has a solid foundation," she liked to say. "You can build anything from there." 2 weeks later, Andy came in for a follow-up appointment. His face lit up when he saw Rose at the nurse's station. "Look," he exclaimed, pulling something from his backpack. It was a drawing of a nurse with wings, wearing a cape made of bandages. "It's you. Dad helped me with the spelling." Rose looked at Peter, who was turning slightly red. "He insisted on coming to this hospital for his follow-up," he explained. "He wanted to show you his drawing." There was something different about Peter today. He traded his paint-splattered clothes for clean jeans and a button-down shirt. His hair was neatly combed, and Rose noticed he trimmed his beard. Their eyes met again, and this time the flutter in her chest was harder to ignore. After checking Andy's breathing and updating his chart, Rose started to say goodbye, but Peter cleared his throat nervously. "I know this might be inappropriate," he began, "and please feel free to say no, but Andy's school is having a carnival this weekend. They have games and food trucks, that sort of thing. We were wondering if maybe you'd like to come." Rose felt her heart speed up. Part of her wanted to say no. She wasn't ready. The wounds were too fresh. But Andy was looking at her with such hope, clutching his nurse superhero drawing, and Peter's invitation held no pressure, just genuine warmth. There's face painting, Andy added hopefully. Dad's terrible at it. Last time he made me look like a confused potato instead of a T-Rex. A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep inside Rose. A real laugh, the kind she hadn't experienced in months. Looking at this father and son, she felt something she hadn't felt since finding Michael's letter, possibility. I'd like that, she heard herself saying. I'd like that very much. Walking back to her apartment that evening, Rose felt lighter somehow. The weight of Michael's betrayal was still there, but it didn't feel quite as crushing. Maybe, just maybe, the universe had bigger plans for her than the perfect life she thought she'd lost. The school carnival buzzed with life on a perfect Saturday afternoon. Children ran between game booths, their faces sticky with cotton candy, while parents chatted in groups under colorful banners. Rose stood at the entrance, nervously smoothing her casual sundress. Was this a mistake? Before she could second-guess herself further, she heard an excited shout. You came. Andy came running toward her, his face already painted with what looked like a lopsided rainbow. Behind him, Peter walked with an apologetic grin, wearing a clean t-shirt that showed off arms strong from years of painting work. I tried to convince him to wait for you before getting his face painted, Peter explained, but he couldn't wait. Though I think I did better than last time, at least you can tell it's supposed to be a rainbow. Rose laughed, feeling her nervousness melt away. There was something comfortable about them, something that didn't demand perfection or pretense. Andy grabbed her hand, eager to show her everything. We have to try the ring toss. And the balloon pop. And they have the best hot dogs. The afternoon passed in a blur of games, laughter, and surprisingly good hot dogs. Rose found herself relaxing more with each passing hour. She watched Peter with his son, the way he listened intently to Andy's excited chatter, how he celebrated every small victory at the game booths, the gentle way he reminded Andy to slow down while eating his snow cone. At the face painting booth, Rose took over after Peter's attempt at turning another child into a tiger looked more like a confused house cat. Her steady hands from years of nursing came in handy as she painted butterflies, stars, and yes, even a pretty impressive T-Rex on Andy's face, after washing off the rainbow. You're good at everything, Andy declared, admiring his dinosaur face in a mirror. Dad, can Rose come to my baseball game next weekend too? Peter looked embarrassed. Buddy, remember what we talked about? We can't assume Rose is free or wants to. I'd love to, Rose interrupted, surprising herself. If that's okay. The smile that spread across Peter's face made her heart skip a beat. As Andy ran off to show his friends his new T-Rex face, Peter and Rose found themselves alone for the first time that day. They sat on a bench, watching the carnival chaos around them. I should tell you something, Peter said quietly. Andy's been talking about you nonstop since the hospital, but I want you to know there's no pressure. I understand if this is too much too soon. Rose looked at her hands, thinking about the wedding ring she'd finally removed just last week. I should tell you something too, she said. I'm kind of a mess right now. My ex-husband, she stopped, unsure how to summarize the betrayal and bankruptcy in casual conversation. I know, Peter said gently. Andy's teacher is friends with one of the nurses. Small town gossip. He paused. For what it's worth, I think you're incredibly strong, and I'm not looking to rush into anything. Being Andy's dad taught me that the best things take time to build. Over the next few weeks, life fell into a new pattern. Rose went to Andy's baseball games, cheering from the bleachers as he ran the wrong way around the bases. Peter started finding reasons to bring Andy for checkups at the hospital, always timing their visits with Rose's shifts. They had lunch together in the cafeteria, sharing stories between bites of mediocre sandwiches. She learned that Peter had started his painting business from scratch after his wife died, wanting flexible hours to be there for Andy. He learned about her dream of eventually opening a pediatric clinic. They talked about their fears, their hopes, the challenges of rebuilding a life after loss. One evening, after Andy's team actually won a game, mostly by accident, they celebrated with ice cream. Watching Peter help Andy clean chocolate sauce off his face, Rose realized something that scared her. She was starting to care about them, really care. The kind of caring that could hurt if things went wrong. That night, in her small apartment, Rose pulled out the box of memories she'd packed away. Photos from her life with Michael, their wedding album, the letters and cards. For the first time, she didn't feel the sharp pain of betrayal. Instead, she felt something like pity for the woman in those photos who thought she had it all figured out. Her phone buzzed with a text from Peter. "Andy says your nurse powers helped him win today." His exact words, "Rose's Lucky Charm bracelet has real magic. Thanks for being there." Rose touched the plastic bead bracelet she still wore, the one her young patient had given her during her darkest days. Maybe it was magic after all, just not the kind she expected. Sometimes the best magic isn't in grand gestures or perfect lives, but in second chances and small moments of joy. She looked at the box of memories one last time before sliding it under her bed. She didn't need to throw it away anymore. Those memories were just part of her story now, not the whole book. The next chapter was still unwritten, and for the first time in a long time, she was excited to see what might happen next. As she got ready for bed, another text came through, a photo of Andy, fast asleep with his baseball mitt still on his hand. Peter's message read, "He insisted on sleeping with his lucky mitt. Think we might need to work on his understanding of what makes a team win games." Rose smiled at her phone, feeling that now familiar flutter in her chest. Maybe her support group friend was right. Rock bottom did have a solid foundation. And maybe, just maybe, she was finally ready to start building something new. Life has a funny way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. For Rose, that curveball came on an ordinary Tuesday morning, 6 months after Michael had walked out of her life. She was having breakfast with Peter and Andy at their favorite diner, a weekly tradition they'd started after Andy's baseball season ended. Andy was telling them about his science project on volcanoes when Rose's phone started buzzing with messages. First from her best friend, then her sister, and finally her former neighbor. Each message said roughly the same thing. "Have you seen the news?" Peter noticed her face change as she read the messages. "Everything okay?" he asked, passing her a napkin as Andy accidentally knocked over his orange juice. I don't know," Rose replied, opening the local news website. And there it was, splashed across the screen. Local financial advisor arrested in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. Michael's booking photo stared back at her, his familiar face now haunted and gray. The article laid out a story that seemed impossible. Michael hadn't just been unfaithful, he'd been running an elaborate Ponzi scheme for years, convincing clients to invest in fake funds while using their money to fund his lavish lifestyle. The other woman he'd left with, she turned him in after discovering the truth about his schemes. Rose's hands shook as she read the details. All those mysterious late-night calls, the unexplained expenses, the way he drained their accounts before leaving, it all made terrible sense now. The man she'd married, the life they'd shared, had been built on lies much bigger than she'd imagined. "Mom always says when grown-ups look worried, they need extra pancakes," Andy announced, pushing his plate toward Rose. The simple gesture, so innocent and kind, brought tears to her eyes. Peter reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Want to talk about it?" Later, after dropping Andy at school, they sat in Peter's truck in the parking lot. Rose told him everything, about the debt she was still paying off, the house she'd had to sell, the shame she'd carried thinking she should have somehow known. "You know, none of this was your fault, right?" Peter said softly. "Some people are just really good at hiding who they really are." "The crazy thing is," Rose replied, wiping her eyes, "I actually feel relieved. All this time, I kept wondering if I did something wrong, if I wasn't enough. But it was never about me at all. He was just a lie. Everything was a lie." That evening, after her shift at the hospital, Rose found a small package waiting at her apartment door. Inside was a frame containing Andy's latest art project, a family portrait from his perspective. He'd drawn himself in the middle, Peter on one side, and Rose on the other, all of them wearing baseball caps and huge smiles. At the bottom, in his messy second-grade handwriting, he'd written, "My family, if that's okay with Rose." Sitting on her small couch, holding Andy's drawing, Rose felt something shift inside her. The news about Michael should have devastated her, but instead, it felt like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. The perfect life she'd lost had been an illusion, but what she'd found instead, this messy, authentic, beautiful connection with Peter and Andy, was real. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Peter. "Andy's worried about you. He wants to know if you'll come over for movie night. His choice this time, so be prepared for either dinosaurs or superheroes. Rose looked around her apartment. The place she'd once seen as a symbol of her failure now felt like a cocoon she'd needed, a safe space to heal and transform. She'd been so focused on what she'd lost that she'd almost missed what she was gaining. "Count me in," she texted back. "But tell Andy it's my turn to pick next week." As she got ready to head over to their house, Rose caught her reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at her wasn't the same one who'd found that devastating letter on her anniversary. This version of herself was stronger, wiser, and surprisingly happier. She'd learned that sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead us exactly where we're supposed to be. The news about Michael would spread. People would talk, ask questions, maybe even pity her. But Rose didn't feel like a victim anymore. The man who'd abandoned her had actually set her free, free to find something real, something true, something that didn't need to look perfect on the outside because it was genuine on the inside. Andy greeted her at the door with a huge hug, already in his dinosaur pajamas. Peter was in the kitchen, attempting to make popcorn without burning it. The house was a little messy, with Andy's school projects scattered around and evidence of their daily life everywhere. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And real, Rose had learned, was so much better than perfect. 3 years can change everything. Rose realized this on a warm spring morning as she stood in front of her mirror, adjusting the simple white dress she'd chosen for today. No elaborate wedding gown this time, just a comfortable dress that made her feel like herself. Through the window, she could hear Andy in the backyard, practicing his best man speech with Peter's sister, who kept reminding him that no, he couldn't include the story about the time his dad fell off the ladder while trying to impress Rose by cleaning the gutters. The garden where they'd chosen to have the ceremony was nothing like the fancy hotel where she'd married Michael. This was the community garden where Peter and Andy had helped her plant vegetables last summer, where they'd spent weekends pulling weeds and planning their future between rows of tomatoes and bell peppers. "You look beautiful," Peter's sister said, coming into the room. And Andy finally agreed to leave out the ladder story, though he's still insisting on telling everyone about how you two met in the emergency room. Rose smiled, remembering that night when a frightened little boy with an asthma attack had unknowingly changed her life. That story he can definitely tell. The past 3 years hadn't been a fairy tale. There had been challenging moments, figuring out how to blend their lives, helping Andy through his occasional struggles with change, dealing with the lingering effects of Michael's betrayal. But every challenge had only made their bond stronger. Rose had finally paid off the last of the debt Michael had left her with, using her savings and some help from a settlement after his conviction. The day she made the final payment, Peter and Andy surprised her with a celebration dinner, mac and cheese with hot dogs, Andy's specialty. "You're not just marrying Dad," Andy had announced that night, sauce all over his face. "You're marrying both of us. That means you have to like hot dogs forever." Now, standing in the garden surrounded by their closest friends and family, Rose watched Andy proudly walk down the aisle in his little suit, carrying their rings on a cushion he'd insisted on making himself. It was slightly lopsided, with uneven stitching, but like everything else about this day, it was perfectly imperfect. Peter waited for her under an arch of climbing roses, looking both nervous and completely certain. When their eyes met, Rose felt that familiar flutter in her chest, not the nervous excitement of her first wedding, but a deep, steady warmth that felt like coming home. They'd written their own vows, simple and honest words about choosing each other every day, about building a family on a foundation of trust and understanding. Andy insisted on adding his own vows too, solemnly promising to always clean his room, a promise everyone knew wouldn't last, and to love Rose as his mom. A promise that had already been kept long before today. During the reception, held in the same garden, Rose looked around at the life she'd built. Her co-workers from the hospital chatted with Peter's painting crew. Andy ran around with his friends, his suit already showing signs of adventure. Their neighbors had brought potluck dishes, filling the tables with a mismatched feast that somehow worked perfectly together. "Just like us," Peter whispered, following her gaze. "A little mismatched, but perfect together." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the garden, an unexpected delivery arrived, a letter from prison. Michael had written to congratulate her on her wedding. News traveled fast in their small town, and to apologize one final time for everything he'd done. Years ago, this letter would have shaken her. Now, Rose read it calmly, feeling nothing but a distant sadness for the man who'd thought perfect appearances were more important than genuine love. She didn't need his apology anymore. She'd already found something far more valuable than the perfect life she'd once thought she wanted. "Mom, Dad," Andy called out, running up to them with his tie completely undone. "They're going to cut the cake. Can I help?" Rose tucked the letter into her pocket, unopened. Some chapters of our lives need to stay closed so new ones can begin. Looking at her son, because that's what Andy had become, in every way that mattered, and her husband, she knew without a doubt that this was the chapter she was meant to be living. That evening, after most of the guests had gone home, the three of them sat on a blanket in their garden. Andy had fallen asleep between them, still in his rumpled suit, frosting on his chin. Peter held Rose's hand, his new wedding ring catching the last light of day. "You know what's funny?" Rose said softly. "When Michael left, I thought he'd ruined my life. But he actually led me right where I was supposed to be. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us turn out to be disguised blessings." Peter squeezed her hand. "Want to know something? The day Andy had that asthma attack, I was actually supposed to take him to a different hospital. But there was traffic, and this was closer. Sometimes the universe has a way of making sure we end up exactly where we need to be." Rose looked at her family, her real family, built on love and trust and second chances, and felt complete. This wasn't the life she planned, but it was better than anything she could have imagined. Sometimes, she realized, you have to let go of the life you thought you wanted to make room for the life that's waiting for you. The story that began with betrayal had ended with belonging. The perfect facade had been replaced by genuine love. And Rose, who once thought she'd lost everything, had found something far more precious. A love that didn't need to look perfect because it was real.